Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Big guest today, author Tom Clavin. Prolific. The dude seems to put out a book like every 6 months. They're all fantastic. Almost all of them are on my shelf. They're fun reads. He keeps it interesting no matter what he's talking about. A lot of stuff on the Wild West. He is one of the best when it comes to that. A lot of World War II. He writes books with other authors. We talk about all of this stuff. Mainly, we're here to talk about Follow Me to Hell. It's about the Wild West, about the Texas Rangers. Fantastic conversation. The book is wonderful, which means I'm going to shut up so we can get to it. Tom Clavin, let's bring him on. All right, here we are with author Tom Clavin. Follow Me to Hell, McNelly's, Texas Rangers, and the Rise of Frontier Justice. Tom, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Tom, I'm not exaggerating when I say that I've waited years to ask you this question. How the hell do you write so many books? I mean, I miss some sometimes. It seems like you got one coming out every 6 months.
Well, I'd like to say I have this stable of authors that, and I'm the impresario, and I just, they just finished these books for me, but it is a one-horse operation. I think probably the most sensible answer is that the books overlap. It's not like I finish one book and it takes me only 3 or 4 or 6 months and then I start the other one. As a solo author, I'm also a collaborative author, especially with my friend Bob Drury. We've done, I think, working on our 8th book now. I'm usually working at the very same time on a solo project and a collaborative project at the same time. And sometimes it's a third book, that I'm working on also. And I think a big part of that is that just works for me. Some people, if they find that they need to take a break from one book, they go on vacation or go stare out the window or take their dog for a 3-day walk or something like that. And instead, for me, what I find refreshing is that if I'm working on one book and I need to take a break from it, I'll switch to another book. And that to me is what refreshes me. I just keep using different muscles and just keep rotating those projects. And that's how it ends up sometimes, where part of it is the production process too. Look at somebody like a Ben Affleck right now. He's got a movie that's coming out on Air, on the Air Jordan sneakers that he's directing in. And he's got another movie that he's starring in that's coming out, I think, in a week or two. Now, that didn't mean he just took 2 weeks to make that second movie. It's just that it depends on the production process. Sometimes they have to schedule something that you had done in plenty of time, but it's not going to be out for another year. And it bumps up against something that's going to be out 6 months later. So most of it I have control over. Some of it I don't.
Now, that is something, too, I wanted to ask about. Bob Drury, you guys write a lot of books together. They're fantastic. How does it work when 2 authors are writing? Because I think a lot of people know it's like, oh, you may have a celebrity who's not used to writing and they get a writer. But I mean, you both are writers in your own right. How does it work when you're actually writing the book together?
It could work different ways for different people. I was recently at the Savannah Book Festival, and there was an interview with Lincoln Childs and Doug Preston, who have done a number of best-selling books together. Usually they're adventure and espionage and swashbuckling stories. They actually trade chapters. I'll write chapter 1, you write chapter 2, I'll do chapter 3. That's not the way Bob and I have worked from the very, very beginning. The first book we did was called Halsey's Typhoon, which came out in 2007. We did not intend to be regular collaborators and do a series of books, but that was just going to be a one-off for us. And for that particular book, we decided that I would primarily be the researcher and the reviser and editor. And basically, I put everything together, serve it on a plate to Bob. He does the actual writing. Then it comes back for me revising and editing. That worked very well. The book went on the New York Times bestseller list. It went very well. So that when the opportunity came to do a second book, we said, that formula worked so well the first time. And basically, we employ that formula. I'm the primary researcher. And then I take what Bob has written and I do some, revising, put in questions, annotate things, and do the grunt in the trenches stuff. Like you have to do a bibliography, you have to do acknowledgments, there's end papers, who takes care of the images. I'll take care of that, just securing all the images for the photo insert. So it's like a double play combination. Some of what we do overlaps, but basically he's the writer and I do most of everything else.
And it probably helps you too, because you sell yourself a bit short with the overlap because you're not, for lack of a better term, a one-trick pony. You've written about sports, you've written about a lot of pieces of the Wild West, World War II, and all of that stuff. So I'm sure that's got to help too, like you said, that being able to kind of bounce between these different things and keep your head in different time periods.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if I was bouncing between 2 or 3 projects and they were all World War II stories or they were all Civil War stories, then that would be difficult. But that's true. To deal with the time travel, has really made a difference because I could be working on a book. Right now I'm working on a book that is another Western that takes place mostly in the 1890s. Yet the book that Bob and I are working on is a story of the mountain men in the 1820s in the far west, 1820s, 1830s in the far west. Not completely dissimilar projects, but pretty dissimilar, so that when I'm bouncing back from one to the other, there is a kind of time travel aspect going on, and the material seems fresh to me when I bounce to it, and then when I bounce back to the 1890s, that material is seeming fresh to me.
All right, so let's talk Follow Me to Hell. How did you decide that this was going to be your next book?
It's an unusual one because a lot of times I start with a character, or start with an event, and then build a story around that. And that's been mostly the rule for me. And this Follow Me to Hell is the exception because I knew a couple of years ago, I was probably researching something else. I can't remember how I came across it, but I saw that 2023 was going to be the bicentennial of the Texas Rangers. And that by itself I thought was remarkable, that you have a law enforcement agency anywhere in the United States that's 200 years old. I mean, it's a century older than the FBI, for example. So I said, gosh, if I could find a good story that involves the Texas Rangers, maybe I could use that as my vehicle for having in the background the history of the Texas Rangers. And as I was doing the research, I came across various adventures the Texas Rangers had pre-Civil War. Some of the legendary captains they had, like John Coffey Hayes and Rip Ford and Sam Walker. But then once I got past the Civil War and found that Leander McNelly, I was sort of like, well, who is that? And I saw he was in the very first class inaugurated into the Texas Ranger Hall of Fame, and that found that he's a very revered figure. But why? What did he do? And so I started researching McNelly, and basically that's how, knowing I was going to do a book on the Texas Rangers first, and then looking for the story that was going to become my centerpiece, I found McNelly and his adventures, which included a completely unauthorized invasion of Mexico in November 1875. So that's when the story started to crystallize for me. It's going to be mostly about McNelly and about his company of Texas Rangers, but to get to that point of where McNelly enters the story, it gave me an opportunity to at least do the greatest hits of Texas Rangers history up to the Civil War.
Now, this time period in history, especially American history, I wonder, for an author, is this an extremely difficult time period to write about? Well, I should say research about, or is it fun? Because it's close enough that there is documentation. The problem is the documentation can often be completely made up. There's 3 different versions, and you talk about it, that there's a lot of different versions to pull from. For you as an author, is it fun to try and kind of figure out what the truth is, or is it a nightmare of, I don't know who's telling the truth here?
No, it's fun. I've compared it to you're panning for gold, and you're sifting through a lot. By the time you get to the bottom, where all the sand has dropped out of your utensil, there may be a couple of gold nuggets at the bottom that you can use. And so I find that's true with research, that I try and cast as wide a net as possible and read however much I can. And over time, you start to be able to distill from everything that I'm reading what is factual and what's been embellished, exaggerated, or simply made up. One of the advantages to the story about Leander McNelly is that very quickly he and his ranger company became well known in Texas law enforcement circles and Texas population in general, so that when they would be going on certain missions, returning from missions, there would be accounts in the newspapers. Not that the accounts you can rely on, a lot of these writers for the newspapers in those days were potential Pulitzer Prize winners. But they did basically, report what they saw, to some extent what they heard, so you have to double check some things. So there is an effort to separate fact from fiction. I had an enormous advantage with McNelly, too, because his the lieutenant of his Texas Ranger company, was a guy named Pidge Robinson. He fancied himself a journalist, and he was quite a good writer. And he actually had a contract with a newspaper to write about McNelly's Rangers' adventures and exploits while they were happening. And he's an entertaining writer. So he would turn in as soon after these adventures. Thankfully, he survived them because they involved some shooting and fighting and everything like that. He would write up these accounts, which are sometimes very funny, and they would be published in the San Antonio newspaper. And so you have that kind of eyewitness right after the fact kind of reporting going on. And then they were published in an entity that thankfully archive still exists. You could find this material there. And there were a couple other people that wrote with McNelly who wrote memoirs of their adventures too. But in those cases, had to do some grain of salt because they were sometimes writing them decades later. So sometimes their memories were not 100%. But the fact that they were personally on these adventures and wrote about them was a big help.
What I like is you clearly also have fun with this as well. I mean, when you're reading your books, this is not dry history. You have fun with it. I like a little aside every now and again. And even And I always appreciate this saying, this probably didn't happen, but the story is too good to leave this out. Like, we got to put this down.
There is a kind of a wink wink aspect to it. I tell the reader, I say, listen, just exactly like you said, there's this story associated with this event that turns out not to be true, but I'm going to give it to you anyway because it's really, really fascinating. And it's an example of how history can be embellished and tainted a bit if you just present it as fact. I'm not presenting it as fact. I'm winking at the audience and saying, here, listen, I'm going to let you in on something here. And there's always fascinating things that take place that sometimes I use as footnotes. I'm a fan of footnotes, not academic footnotes, where I put in there, you'll find more information about this in chapter 2, page 12 of some textbook. There's a book that I have coming out in November called The Last Outlaws. And one of the prominent characters is killed off and he's buried at a certain cemetery. And today in the grave next to him is somebody who's killed at the right about the same time period, another outlaw, but he wasn't buried in the cemetery until 1977. So the footnote is all about what happened to him in the preceding 80 years.
Well, I know growing up in an Irish Catholic family from New York, I was taught never let the truth get in the way of a good story. I mean, that's just how you ruin it, right?
Yeah. And there's the great line from John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, when the legend and the fact, I guess, disagree, you print the legend.
Absolutely. So another thing that you have to do in this, you've had to do this, all your Wild West books, and we're just going to say Wild West to kind of cover the entire time period, is you've got to do a huge introduction. I mean, that's got to be, for a lot of authors, they'll say, just get right to it. But that is a difficulty of writing about this time period is there's a lot of people who come in and out, and you got to kind of do an introduction, like you said, doing an introduction to the Texas Rangers before you get to McNelly. And that's got to be a tightrope for an author to have your, quote unquote, main character show up a little bit further in the book than would be expected.
That's, again, why this book was the exception and not the rule about books that I've done. Because, yes, usually in Dodge City, for example, you don't have to wait very long until you get to Wyatt Earp and Batman Masterson and then eventually Doc Holliday. They're prominent characters early on in the book. Same thing with Wild Bill. Hickok is right there at the beginning. But in this case, the Texas Rangers are 50 years old before McNelly becomes a Texas Ranger captain. And I didn't feel that you could decide to ignore it. I mean, you could put Texas Ranger history up to that point in 50 years in one chapter, possibly. I don't think I know how to do it, but there's probably writers who could. But the history was so interesting to me, and I think you had to sort of set the stage for McNelly's entrance onto that stage. I do have to say that from the first draft to the second draft to the third draft, I kept getting out my cutting shears because I kept cutting. I said, this is too much before McNelly appears. So I kept cutting it back and cutting it back and cutting it back. I remember, reading the book at the final stage, the page proofs before they went to press. I think, is this too long? Should I keep cutting and keep cutting? But I think people who read the book will see that there's just a lot of interesting stories with a lot of colorful, interesting characters. So it would have been hard to cut more out.
I definitely think so. As I was reading it, even as somebody who loves history, there is so much too that you don't think about. If you do it a quick introduction, you wouldn't understand that you're talking about being right on the U.S.-Mexican border, or Texas, U.S., Mexican, and all of these things that come together. I always felt as I'm reading it is I'm getting a lot of information that I just wouldn't have understood. Like when you talk about frontier justice, people think about just that a Wild West TV show and like, oh, there's a marshal and he shoots people sometimes and no one seems to care. But you take the time in this to explain, like, these people are out in the middle of nowhere with 2 or 3 different forces on each side of them. And it really was lawless, especially before the Texas Rangers kind of come into being, right?
It was. In Texas in the 1820s, when they were first trying to establish, Stephen Austin was trying to establish his colony there, 300 families. And it was under the ownership at the time of Mexico. You couldn't really depend on the Mexican government and Mexican law enforcement officials to offer much in the way of protection, partly because they just didn't have the personnel, and partly because Mexico was undergoing its own turmoil. It had just declared independence from Spain. Spain was not too happy about it, so Spain was constantly coming up with schemes about how to get Mexico back, and which included at one point, or more than once, let's just invade Mexico and take it back. So the Mexican government and officials were pretty preoccupied with their own issues. So the colony that Austin established, they needed to protect themselves. In some cases, it was from cattle rustling and horse stealing, and in many cases, it was in those early days from the Karankawa and some of the other Indian tribes that surrounded them, who understandably were like, "What are you guys doing here? This is our land, our hunting ground. Who invited you?" Well, you could respond. The Texans could respond with the Mexican government, and the Indians would respond, "Well, who invited them? This is our land, and this is our hunting ground, and you're stealing food off. Essentially, you're stealing food off our table." So the Texas Rangers were formed as initially as sort of like Minutemen, sort of like Lexington and Concord kind of thing. Hey, we have an urgent matter here, or we have an attack underway or imminent. Put the call out, get as many guys that knew how to ride a horse and shoot a rifle here together as much as possible. Once the event was resolved one way or the other, everybody went back to their farm fields, their storekeeping, their ranching. So the part of the interest in me doing the book is the evolution of the Texas Rangers. They started as a way for border protection, which was a lot of times an ad hoc kind of thing, made up as they went along. But it evolved over the decades, over the generations. That made it interesting to me because you have an organization that is 200 years old. It went through a lot of growing pains to get there.
And that was really interesting when you say ad hoc. The Texas Rangers didn't have, we think about, it's a police force. It's kind of almost like a state police or something. But when they were formed, it really was ad hoc. There wasn't an understanding of this is what they can do, this is what they can't do, this is where they can go, and this is where they can't. But for a lot of people, that might be the only unit or organization that they can actually turn to keep themselves safe from whatever was kind of coming over the hill.
Right. You didn't have established police departments. Or marshal's offices or sheriff's offices or anything like that. I mean, eventually there was plenty of that in Texas, especially in the early years. You needed groups like the Texas Ranger companies, which could be thrown together very quickly and have them deal with an attack by an Indian tribe, or the cattle rustling was getting rampant, of course, along the Mexican border to deal with that. So there was, I don't want to say a stability that the Texas Rangers offered, because even the Texas Rangers had a lot of challenges in those early days, mostly because there was no money to pay them. They were constantly forming these companies that occasionally they get paid $5 a month, or you get paid in ammunition, just bring your own horse and gun. It was many, many years before there was some kind of permanent budget to pay Texas Rangers and make them a more professional organization. But in the early years, I don't know if you'd even be able to call them militia. Militia confers upon them a little more of an organized, disciplined force than they were.
Because they weren't even permanent, right? If it's like the money ran out, it's like, hey, everybody head on home. We'll call you if we need you.
Well, yeah, get back to your farm, and maybe we'll see you next year when there's some money to pay you guys. Now, of course, if there was an urgent matter, one of the stories that I depict in the book is about this long Indian wagon train, so almost that went on an invasion. Lone Wolf and a couple other Indian leaders went on an invasion. And of course, with a lot of homes and villages threatened, you're not going to stop and say, well, how much am I getting paid to protect, this town or protect this farmland? No, you have, you and the others band together to do the best you can. But it certainly made a difference to Frontier Justice in the subtitle when money was budgeted to try and keep people on the payroll. It's one of the things Leander McNelly did. In between missions, he tried as much as possible to keep his company together and do things like training and riding and shooting and working together as a team to just make his company more professional. He was kind of like a transition captain in that respect, from the way that it had been done in the old days to the new way of the Texas Rangers.
So tell me a little bit more about McNelly, right? Because obviously, if he's a Hall of Fame Texas Ranger, he was probably 6'4", a solid 250, very robust. That was McNelly, right?
Yeah, you would think he's this Chris Pratt kind of character, almost like this superhero kind of guy. But McNelly, well, he had what they used to call in the day more often a consumption. Became clear he had it when he was still an adolescent. His family had originally settled in Virginia, and a reason he ended up in Texas was he went there with an older brother who wanted to start a farm in Texas, but also thought Lee McNelly, his younger brother, would benefit from the drier, warmer climate. Even one of his admiring rangers who rode with him described him as puny. He's 5'5", he was thin, sickly. Oddly, or maybe because of that, that's one of the things that inspired the men who rode with him, is that they saw the effort it took for him every day to get on his horse, to ride all day, to fight, to chase down bad guys. The toll it took on him, how exhausted he could be at the end of the day. And the idea was, if he could do it, then I'm certainly going to be able to do it, or I should do it too, because I've got to show that I'm at least half the guy he is. He wasn't humorless, but he had sort of like a dark sense of humor. I guess you consider him a handsome enough man. He was some kind of distinctive looking. Thin, of course, because I don't think too many consumptives get to be too robust. I think a big part of his fearlessness was that he'd rather, not that he had any kind of death wish at all, But knowing that he had the kind of illness that was not going to allow him to live a normal lifespan, he'd much rather die in battle, than die in bed.
And I mean, this is kind of that Wild West cliche that you often see. It's the guy that's coughing constantly, and he's coughing into a handkerchief, and there's blood on it. But I mean, this was for a lot of people. I mean, the amount of Wild West figures that we can name that had consumption is crazy. But this was really for him. Like, he knew early on that there was that death sentence over him. And yet he's going out and he's riding for days on end and just getting in the face of people that could very easily kill him right there.
What you're probably kind of referring to, one of the most indelible performances in a Hollywood Western was Val Kilmer as Doc Holliday in the film Tombstone. There was somebody obviously with serious lung disease. It was kind of exaggerated in the movie because actually during his stay in Tombstone, Doc Holliday was relatively healthy because the climate was good. It was after he left Tombstone and went and moved to Colorado that his consumption really got very, very bad. If you can think back to Val Kilmer and Tombstone, that was kind of like the way McNelly was. Maybe not quite as serious. Sometimes it flared up and he was out of action. And his men would have to sort of nurse him back to health, or his wife, Carrie, would nurse him back to health. And that's what kept getting him back in the saddle. He was only a Texas Ranger captain for 3 years. And a big reason because of that is because his career was cut short. He reached the point where he's just too ill to go lead his men into battle anymore.
Kind of jumping towards the end, I don't want to completely give away this entire scenario, but McNelly decided to invade Mexico. This is one of those stories you read about it and you're like, how is this not in some history book somewhere? Why is this the first time I'm seeing this? What happens that actually brings about that episode in the book?
The Texas Rangers under McNelly were kind of like a SWAT team. Where the need was the most urgent, then they got sent. And in this one particular case, in 1875, he was sent to try and do something about the rampant cattle rustling that was going on in what was called the Nueces Strip, which is the piece of Texas in the southeast that's between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River. And so his job was to try and curb that rustling. These ranchers were losing their cattle by the tens and dozens and hundreds. So he and his Texas Rangers tried to do that, but they'd stop maybe some rustling in one part of the border, but then it'd be happening someplace else, and then it'd be happening someplace else. And they'd stop another aspect of it, but it was happening someplace else. So this one particular time in November of that year, McNelly basically said, "I'm fed up, and we've got to teach a lesson to the rustlers on the other side of the Rio Grande." So the next time they were chasing after some cattle rustlers who were bringing cattle across the river, they went across the river too. They basically invaded Mexico. He said, "Let's go, guys. Let's take the fight to them." And he did. And there was some fighting going on the Mexican side. And as you can imagine, this risked a war, a second Mexican-American war, because it's kind of not kosher to invade other countries because you feel like you think it's a good idea, a law enforcement idea. It's an international incident. So, and in fact, when encountered the Mexican army and was sort of retreating to the river, they refused to leave the Mexican side of the river. They dug in to put up a fight on the Mexican side. And they were on the other side of the river, where as a troop of U.S. cavalry who were under orders not to at any time cross the river and help the Texans. Because that for sure, if you sent U.S. troops, federal troops across the river, that's going to start a war. So there's telegrams arriving from Washington. You can even assume President Ulysses Grant was behind one of them that said, you got to come back over here or surrender or do something, but you got to stop this right away. And McNelly's response was basically, well, he wasn't just basically, he telegrammed back, "Go to hell. I'll come back when I got those stolen cows." So I don't want to give away the how that story ends, but that was the kind of the predicament, and also showed the kind of plucky, irascible person that Captain Leander McNelly was, and his version of frontier justice.
McNelly's very interesting, and you run into, especially a lot of things nowadays, we're looking at history a bit differently, our tastes and our thoughts about something. I mean, McNelly is kind of a man of his time, where you always have to look at it and say, well, there's also things about him that we wouldn't necessarily like nowadays or agree with. For you as an author, do you have to deal with that more now within your books to make sure to kind of put these things in perspective, or is it something that you're highlighting what you're highlighting and you go with it?
Well, that's a good question, because I point out in the book that McNelly, he used some tactics that we would frown upon. There were people that were killed on some of his missions, and he could be quick to use a gun, and his men could be quick to use a gun. There's a particular character in the book called Jesus Sandoval, who becomes part of McNelly's Rangers, and he's basically the interrogation expert. And some of his interrogation methods are the kind of things that would make Dick Cheney proud. And McNelly knew this was going on. He didn't endorse it, but he didn't condone it either. He just appreciated the information that was gleaned from these people who underwent these interrogation techniques. And yes, there was a kind of a freelance aspect to McNelly. Like his version of justice was the right version wherever he was, because there was no other version that was going to take over his version. And he could be kind of unorthodox. He could be kind of unjust in his ways of applying rough justice. I think I point that out a couple of times. I think his actions speak louder than words. People reading the book are going to read about it because I put it in there. I think what would be different is, for example, if I did not use the Jesus Sandoval character at all, or I used the character but didn't inform readers. Well, he was basically the enforcer for the McNelly's Rangers, and you didn't want to end up on the wrong end of a rope from him. So I think that the actions show that McNelly was not an armchair ranger captain. He was somebody who was out there all the time, and he had to sometimes employ unsavory methods.
And I think you make a very good point about this. Just by the other characters you introduce, is somebody that he wants dead in one chapter can be an ally in the next chapter. And that was just life back in the day, right? Like, that guy's an outlaw this week, next week, oh no, he's a friend of ours. He's going to come along while we go take care of this other guy who used to be our friend last week. It was a very, very confusing and morally great time.
Yeah, alliances were constantly shifting. It was a very fluid time because, yes, you're right that somebody could be on the wrong side of the law in one situation or in one county or even in one state. And then 6 months later, it's a different situation. It's a different county. It's a different state. And they're on the right side of the law. Let's face it, you only had so many people to go around at that time. And somebody who was found themselves, maybe for self-preservation purposes, doing their own cattle stealing one year, the following year is a deputy marshal who's tracking down, cattle thieves.
Love it. Now, big question. In your pantheon of Texas Rangers, how important is McNelly? You said short amount of time, only 3 years. How important is he in Texas Ranger history?
Well, he's an important character in Texas Ranger history because of, and I point this out in my author's note at the beginning of the book. He is viewed as a transitional character. If you read other books about the Texas Rangers, and they almost all use that same phrase about McNelly. He was transitional because he was, up to that point, the Rangers were still kind of a militiaman kind of outfit, sort of like sometimes a spontaneous outfit put together for a specific purpose and then disbanded. And McNelly's Rangers operated with very few interruptions for the 3 years and beyond, really. When he was replaced as captain, there was still a McNelly's Rangers. So they operated for several years, being shifted from one necessity to another, whether it was cattle rustling on the Mexican border, whether it was going up against a man named John King Fisher, who thought he basically owned the Oasis Strip. And they were disciplined and they were trained to be Texas Rangers, trained to be proud to be Texas Rangers. And that was their job. Their job was not farmer and part-time Texas Ranger. They were full-time Texas Rangers. And he led them in an inspiring way. So even though he only was captain for 3 years, the way he led the Rangers and that legacy he left behind really resonated for decades to come. And that's why it didn't surprise me that he had a captain who was only captain for 3 years, yet was in that inaugural class of Texas Ranger Hall of Fame.
So, Tom, one of the reasons we founded History Nerds United is that a lot of people think of history as a class from school that they took. They passed the tests back then. History is boring. We don't need to be reading about it. If I put one of those admittedly very wrong people in front of you and they said, I don't like to read history, why should I read Follow Me to Hell? What would you say?
I have to say one reason why I think you might want to read Follow Me to Hell is I think it's crafted to be kind of a page turner. Everybody likes a good story, and I think it's a good story with a lot of colorful characters. It's kind of a sprawling book because it covers a lot of ground, a lot of time period, a lot of characters are squeezed in there. But I think it tells us a lot about Texas history. It tells us a lot about the United States history. I think what was happening in Texas during the period that I cover is a microcosm of what was happening in the rest of the country. I find history fun. Now, of course, I'm biased because I do it as a profession to write about historical events. I just feel like I don't want to use the word educated. I think I'm a better person because I know about things, important events that took place in our country's history and some of the characters. I mean, when Bob Drury and I were writing Blood and Treasure, for example, which is our main character is Daniel Boone, that to me was fascinating. There's so many things about Daniel Boone that I did not know that I think most people don't know. Daniel Boone is a recognizable name, but most people don't know who was really Daniel Boone and what did he do and when did he do it. I think being better informed because you enjoyed a good story is a really fun experience. It's certainly, something that, depending on your situation, but I passed down, I think, a love of history and good stories to my children. I think a lot of people want to do that, pass down good stories and the love of reading and the love of history to their children because it just makes them, I think you're just going to have better human beings and at the risk of sounding kind of jingoistic, better Americans.
Works for me, Tom. It's a great book. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much.
And that's it for this episode. Tom, thank you so much for coming on. Hit us up, people. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Send us comments. Rate the podcast. Listen to other episodes. Tell all your friends about it. Every little bit helps. We appreciate you listening. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.